Yes, Ted.
Okay, thank you very much. We are very happy to have Ryan here and to talk to us. And Anitra will be introducing him in a minute or two. She's worked with him for a long time and is far better to introduce them than I am. I'm going to introduce the general session. We're going to go for about 40 minutes or so with him and talks. But we have a second objective, which is to kind of set up where we're going next, because this is one in a series of very productive and interesting sessions, all of which are looking at how we really change the way the world perceives good and how they understand what it is. As David Corton said the first time, you can't eat money. And in fact, we are looking at replacing the usual very economic and narrow metrics with something that we are describing as well-being. And each of us so far has made a contribution that lets us understand maybe what we really mean by well-being and also how to measure it. And I'll lead a bit of a discussion at the end of this session on really thinking of where we want to go next. And we have a couple of events coming up, one in Boston and one a chance to present what we're doing to the General Assembly of the Club of Rome, both of which are in the future. And the question for the end of this is, what are we going to do to make sure that we can, in fact, have something useful to contribute? So that said, I'd like to put us back to the main subject at hand. Ryan's going to talk to us, and Anitra, please introduce him properly.
Thank you, Ted. So I'm impressed. Just a general remark before I begin with Ryan. I'm very impressed as each of the voyageurs says, and behind me is one of my restorations in Borneo, by the way. Each of the voyageurs talks about what they have done and the accumulated emphasis and product of what they've done, that there are tens of thousands of people involved with each of us. I mean, it's sort of a rich background. And I started counting up and I got to over 100,000 in the groups that have already pivoted from thinking financial growth is the major thing we should be doing in this world. And then I think a next thing we should talk about in terms of paradigm change is the anticipatory models, which we already have, some of which are very ancient. For instance, the hurricane model, which everybody doesn't have to be urged to accept, but they want to accept, because during hurricane season, everybody in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean is totally focused on that model, which actually is the overlay of 16 to 18 different weather models, and they're blended. The models that seem to work for one part of the world and another part of the world are all blended together, which is basically what our overview is going to look like. We're going to be a blending of models for medical, for political science, for environment and ecology, for social sciences. So that's another thing that we should keep in mind. But we have to remember that when Einstein figured out his energy, mass energy equation, E equals mc squared, which is thought to be the most prevalently known equation in the world, it took him several years of really intense work on this. It wasn't easy. He simplified and simplified. He had a huge mass of data and he kept simplifying down into those 4 or 5 symbols. So as we begin this afternoon to look at our metaphysical analysis, we should keep that in mind. But turning to Ryan. Ryan, in case you hadn't noticed, we have 4 physicians in our Voyageur group, and they are, of course, Julia Kim, who's already presented, Rampella, who has presented, Tom Powers, and Ryan Jackson. And Ryan presently is the president of the International Medical Consulting Company, and he's formerly the dean of the Caribbean Medical University. He's also been the CEO of the Wyoming Business Coalition on Health. He is on the board of directors of a couple organizations, of course, USACOR being one of them, and the Brain Injury Alliance of Wyoming. But most importantly, like the firefighters and the police in 9/11, when he saw the burning building, he rushed in while everybody else was rushing out. And Ryan has done this for multiple kinds of catastrophes around the world, including in 2010, of course, the horrendous earthquake, followed by tremors and other things and hurricanes, coordinating aid from the United Nations and prevention education, environmental restoration, and helping community support, as well as the stream of physicians that we were able to pass to him, who he supported and took to the various places. But he has been in many catastrophes in many parts of the world: Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. So let us listen to Ryan's tale of going from catastrophe to wellness. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Anitra and Ted. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about myself so you guys can figure out who I am and what I am talking about. So I'm going to share my screen and you will see some of my slides. So, all right, and keep the questions for the end and we will talk about this. As many of you know, the world has been going to hell in a handbasket, and there's all kinds of craziness going on. And I'm just going to try to shed some light on how to deal with this insanity. So there's a very well-known quote from the beginning of Charles Dickens' classic Tale of Two Cities. But a lot of times we stop with the first part of the first sentence. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. So he wrote that in 1859 about a prior period, and yet it still feels so much like today. We're living in a time of madness. We have all the information available to us, and we're living in complete ignorance of it. So I'll tell you about myself. I was raised in a simple family. You know, when I was born, we were living in a trailer in a very bad trailer park. So I had two brothers and a sister, and then the girl in red is one of my cousins. And I'm the smug toddler on the far right. And unfortunately, I think I still seem a little too smug. And my first experience overseas after being raised by a single mother on welfare was as a missionary in Brazil. And a nerdy one at that. That's a buckyball that I made out of toothpicks and gumdrops. So, but that exposed me to what the real world is. I thought that as a kid raised on welfare in Wyoming, that I had it as hard as anybody could possibly have it. Then in Brazil, I was exposed to people who were living in dire poverty. And the only reason they had food on their table was because of government mandates restricting the price of bread and rice and beans and coffee. And I saw families that suffered so much. In my first month in Brazil, I met a family that had been solidly middle class in Sao Paulo, but one incident changed everything in their lives. They had a car, they had a home, but their car wasn't insured, and they were hit by a drunk driver who also wasn't insured. Destroyed their car, they couldn't afford to replace it. Their son, who was 7 at the time, was severely injured and spent months in the hospital. The father stayed by his side while he was in the hospital, lost his job. They lost their house. So when I met them, they were living in a tiny one-room shack with one of the filthiest toilets I've ever had to use. They didn't have electricity or running water, and they were slowly trying to rebuild. And the only income coming in for that family was from buying 100-pound sacks of onions and breaking them down into 5-pound sacks. But they were happy because they had their family. The son lived, even though he could barely walk, even while he was holding on to a surface. He couldn't talk. But the family had their unity, and they would sing together and celebrate the life that they were given. To love it all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. I love C.S. Lewis. He taught a lot about pain, even before he knew what real pain was. He suffered quite a bit in his life. But he didn't really know what loss was other than losing his mother as a child, and then he finally fell in love and lost his wife as an adult. But are we going to give up on exposing ourselves and making ourselves vulnerable in order to protect ourselves? Or are we going to put ourselves out there and allow the pain to happen? So this is a dear family that I knew in Belize. They were refugees from El Salvador. They fled the violence and poverty there. The father was working 16 hours a day in the orange groves for $5 American, which was more than he had been making in El Salvador. And at the time, the crime in El Salvador and the risk of kidnapping or murder was higher than in Belize. And so they fled with their little family. And I helped them to get legalized, and so they started making more money. Now, home behind them, they shared with his brother and his brother's wife and children. Altogether, there were about 15 people sharing that simple home. No glass in the windows, no floor other than dirt. But again, they were one of the happiest families I've ever met. These little girls would carry buckets of corn on their head, barefoot, down the road to be ground into cornmeal for food. And they genuinely were as happy as they appear in the picture. Until, as the mother was pregnant with I believe it was their 8th child, and she had had all of their previous children delivered at home by the husband. She was in excruciating pain, and they called me up after I had left Belize. And I told them to go instantly to the hospital. And they found out that her cervical cancer had spread through her body, and they told her she needed to instantly start aggressive treatment to manage that. But she wanted to give the child a chance. So she waited until about 7.5 months of pregnancy when the baby could be delivered. And then she started her aggressive chemotherapy and radiation. They had to return to El Salvador because in Belize they didn't have the treatment that she needed. That invalidated the work permit that he had. And in the end, she died. So I wrote a poem for the family while she was still suffering in the hospital. And I gave it to them after she passed away in English and Spanish. And I'll share that with you. I can't stand to see you like this. I can't force myself to leave. You've been with me and raised our children. Now all you know is pain. Our daughters can't bear to see you. I had to make them leave. They love you so much, nearly as much as I do. What will I do without you? What will I tell our son? His mother will never hear his voice, will never see him walk. You'll always be there in our hearts, as you were, not as you are. We love you. We'll miss you. You were a mother and a wife, a companion and a friend. You held me up when I was lost, sacrificed everything for me. I never had anything to give you, but together we knew joy. I don't know how I could live without you. Please don't stay here just for me. So this family who never had anything finally lost the one thing that really mattered. How is that fair? How can so many people in this world be suffering beyond what they ever should have to? The world is full of pain. So I saw pain in Central America and South America and poverty. And then in 2010, I arrived in Haiti just a couple of weeks after the terrible earthquake there. And that people who lost everything, this young man, we fitted with prosthetic limbs. He lost his legs when the National Cathedral collapsed, and he was just outside the wall. But can we live like this? Can we have hope in this hopeless world? Here's a quote from Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist and a prisoner during World War II. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So I arranged to have this cart for this young man, and because it could handle the rough terrain a little better than the wheelchair he had. And that was while we were waiting for the prosthetic limbs to be manufactured for him. Then I helped others. This is one of the prosthetists who came down with our team from Wyoming. This is a little girl who lost her foot around the ankle. And we were able to get her a new foot and ankle prosthesis, and she was playing soccer within 20 minutes of receiving that. But that little girl has known more pain than most of us in her short life, and she was still so happy. And there was so much devastating loss. So many lives, so many homes, so many businesses. And these are people who, before the earthquake, were in dire poverty. Before the earthquake in Haiti, most of the people were living on less than $2 a day. It was 80% were living on less than $2 a day, and 54% were living on less than $1 a day. And then to have this happen. This was a typical day with our team of doctors out there. I saw up to 200 patients a day myself, and then the others with us saw many more. This was in a village where they had never seen an American, and so they had me stand there, and the children lined up so they could touch me, and they wanted to touch my hair, so I had to bend down so they could touch my hair because they'd never seen anything like it. And this was a school that we helped arrange for military tents to be able to hold the school. They were able to save some of the chairs and desks. This is a 30-kilo box of rice that we got through my negotiations with the Brazilian military, who were in charge of the UN peacekeepers in Haiti. They were able to give it to us directly instead of through the corrupt system there, where the Ministry of Health was asking for up to $1,500 a week for just one small clinic to provide the things that were given for free by the United Nations. So much lost. This was the National Cathedral, of which they were so proud. There's the Brazilian colonel that I was able to connect with, delivering, that's millions of dollars worth of medications and supplies. So to lighten the mood a bit, this is a comic from today. I thought it was relevant. Defining the past, present, and future. The past, the period of time that has already happened. Future, the period of time that has not yet happened. And the present, the period of time that I regret what has happened and dread what has not yet happened. I don't know whether to fail him or cry. I always choose crying. Too often, as we see these devastating things in the media, it overwhelms us and we don't know what to do. We don't know how to handle this. And how can we find a way through this? We find hope, that there is still hope, and we can still keep trying. Oh, sorry, somebody is playing music. Okay, and all right, so I will go back to this, and so this is in Guatemala. So for 7 years, I would take a group of doctors and nurses to Guatemala, and we would help the people there. They were lined up to be able to be seen by us. And there's a little tent for the triage, and they would get their vital signs taken and determine which one of the physicians or nurses they should see. And we also had a Guatemalan dentist who would help with us, and she did so many extractions every day. There were some terrible teeth. But with COVID, I was unable to return there. This is a kid who was tongue-tied, which usually in developed countries would be something that would have been dealt with in the first year of life, because it affects their speech as well as their sucking. It's hard for a baby to feed on the breast or the bottle when they have this. They're not able to latch on as well. And this was a 5 or 6 year old boy who had this, and we were able to help him receive the simple procedure for that. And a little girl who came in for a checkup. This is a man who was 65 years old, had never had a pair of shoes in his life. and he was still working hard every day. A lot of his work was in the river. He'd have to carry things across the rivers or do some construction work near the rivers. Walking back and forth across the river so long, his feet were starting to hurt him. So I couldn't fit him into a regular pair of shoes because his feet were so swollen and so broad and calloused from 65 years of being barefoot. But I was able to finally find him a used pair of shoes specifically made to walk in the water. So some people use them for beaches, and they were elastic enough that they could fit him. And then I had to pay another quarter for a spare pair of shoelaces. So altogether, I put in about $1.25, and this man got the first pair of shoes he had ever worn. And we took them on a trial run, and he was able to see that they would work. So, are we tilting at windmills, trying to make this world a more hopeful place? Are we wasting our time? I really love the work of Cervantes. You know, many people have heard of Man of La Mancha and things like that. I loved reading the original in Spanish. But this one quote, which is part of the musical, is one man scorned and covered with scars still strove with his last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable stars, and the world will be better for this. He was a madman trying to fight for a better world. I strongly believe that whatever we can do in this world, whatever love we show, whatever compassion we have, whatever little help we give is going to make a difference. Will help restore hope to the hopeless and help them see that they are humans. One of the most terrible things that I've seen, which is an old tactic, is the dehumanization of people who are different or who disagree with us, regardless of political party or nation or race or whatever differences we have. Dehumanizing those who are different from us is one of the most devastating things that we can do. And when you see this as it's been systemized in so many places where it's such a part of the social function, that the people start believing it. They start believing that they are not truly human, that they are somehow less than the others. And as we show kindness to these people, as we remind them that they are human, that they deserve to live, and they deserve to have joy in this life, that can help restore their hope, even in a hopeless situation. We may not be able to help all of them. As a couple of weeks ago, I was in California helping with two wonderful organizations which have evacuated a great number of women and children and their families from Afghanistan. Some of those women were so hopeless and hurting so much because they couldn't do more. They couldn't save all of them. And I tried to help them see that even though they couldn't save all of them, that they had done such a great amount of good. And they had helped so many. And even the ones they weren't able to rescue physically, they were able to free their minds by having them see that women can be so much more than property.
They can see that women are human and that they deserve to be treated as humans. And that is a lasting good that can never be taken away. This was in Puerto Rico 3 years ago. This was my last, or no, 2 years ago, my last trip before COVID shut down so much of the travel. They had a lot of earthquakes, and while I was there, they kept having more earthquakes. And the people were so scared. You know, these strong men who had handled terrible hurricanes every year, they were terrified by earthquakes because they didn't know how to predict them, how to prepare for them. So I had to help them see that they can get through this, that they can know how to protect their families. And, you know, the same emergency gear that they have for the hurricanes, they can leave that by the door, and when things start shaking, they can grab that and go. And just these little things helped them restore their hope that they wouldn't be destroyed. And it helped them see that someone cared enough to listen to them and to talk to them and comfort them. So even though I couldn't rebuild their homes, I did connect them with organizations that did have the means to do that and had food and water for them. But I was there to listen and offer little support. And I wanted to do so much more. In each of these countries, I wanted to do so much more. But I had my limitations. This was a wonderful couple. They were the happiest ones I met in Puerto Rico because they couldn't remember. The husband, every 30 seconds, would tell me about his service in World War II, of which he was very proud. And then his wife would cut him off every 30 seconds and tell me that she had never been through an earthquake. And they just kept repeating the same thing. But they were happy. In their case, they were happy partly because of their ignorance and partly because they still had each other. But having that family connection was so important to them. And then again, knowing that someone came to check on them and to show them that they mattered, that they weren't forgotten amid so many that needed help. And a few months after that, they had last year there was a volcanic eruption in St. Vincent. And I couldn't travel there because they had a quarantine for COVID at the time. I worked with my church to help get desperately needed food and water there. And then I was supervising a team of counselors remotely over Zoom and following up with them over WhatsApp and things like that, making sure that they had the things they needed. And so much of it was just listening to them, helping them know that this wasn't the end of the world, that they would be able to go back to their homes eventually, that their lives would be able to get back to normal. Even if it wasn't living in the lap of luxury, they would be able to be restored to peace. Part of the problem from that volcano was that the lava blocked the river that provided most of their drinking water. So the left picture is before the volcano and the right picture is after the volcano. You see the flow has significantly decreased and was not able to be processed in their existing water treatment plants. So a lot of what I was having to help with was making sure that the water shipments were coming in. Because a lot of times people don't think of how much water people need to get through a day. This is part of the lava flow. That's the edge of the river. Used to be about 6 meters deep of water. Now it's lava. And since then, they've been able to restore the flow. But there were several months in which the people were terrified that they wouldn't have enough water to survive. And about a third of the population of St. Vincent had to evacuate from their homes. Most of them have been able to return since then. But the fear and the desperation that they were feeling, that was what we needed to help with. We helped them with the food and water, and we had shelters. Many of them were sheltered in schools or churches, but we got the counselors out to them. They were going to these little areas where they were sheltered. There was one church where there were about 50 people sheltered in one church. And we had the counselors meet with the families and with the individuals and help them work through the fear that they were experiencing. Some of it was as simple as just psychological first aid. And so I trained these counselors on how to do that rather than a full therapy session, because we just didn't have enough counselors to go around to do full therapies for everyone. But first, I sent them through doing the first aid and then flagging the people who needed more intensive therapy. And then we were able to do the therapy. And then there were a few that they were able to identify who had existing psychological disorders and psychiatric disorders. And we were able to connect them with the medications that sometimes they weren't able to access because they had to evacuate. But most of what we were doing is trying to help these people feel safe and that someone cared about them. And then, while they had water shortages, the floods came. And they didn't have the resources to collect the rainwater, but it was enough to destroy a lot of the infrastructure. So not the water they needed to save their lives, but enough to make things a lot more difficult. So, but as I've worked with these people, I've tried to help them see that when they have a reason, they can get through anything. Viktor Frankl, again, he shared this, where those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. And I have seen that firsthand. Back in 2010, a woman was brought to me who had attempted suicide. That woman, when she was explaining through her tears why she couldn't stand to live in this world any longer, I just wept with her, because on the day of the earthquake, she had been celebrating because her 3 children and her 5 grandchildren came for a visit. And while she was preparing a snack for them in the kitchen, her family was 3 meters away, about 10 feet away in the other room, and the house collapsed on them, wiped out her entire posterity in one shot, and destroyed all of her worldly possessions. She literally lost everything. And when I heard that, I told her that I couldn't possibly understand the pain she was feeling, and that I prayed to God to never understand that pain. But I said that through that pain, she could understand the many people in Haiti who had lost their loved ones more than I ever could. So I asked her to use that pain to help the widows and orphans in a way that I couldn't. So I connected her with organizations that were focused on the widows and orphans. And I kept following up with her to see how she was doing. And after a few months, I saw a miracle in that woman's life, because I saw that woman smile as she was surrounded by little children again. And she had found her purpose. She felt like she had a reason to keep living. It didn't bring back her material possessions. It didn't put her in a country that was safer or wealthier. But she found a purpose. And she was able to use the great love she had, which was the reason that she was hurting so deeply for the loss of her family. She was able to use that love to help others. And that will always be with me. And that is why I keep trying. That and many other experiences like that keep me going in a world that seems pointless. So I invite each of you to not give up, no matter how terrible this world gets. We're seeing war, we're seeing poverty, we're seeing completely unfair things in this world. But we can still stand as examples and restore hope to those we can. That's my invitation.
Well, Ryan, thank you for such a powerful narrative in defiance of catastrophe, complete defiance of catastrophe and passivity. And I'm sure that our voyageurs have questions, but one of mine is, how did you get the people to accept you and your fellow medical and other helpers to allow them to be helped? It seems to me that they were all very independent kind of people, and that the initial interaction had to be quite intuitive on your part to get into their hearts so that you could help them medically and with other help.
Mm-hmm.
And that, there's no one size fits all kind of thing for that. But sincerity is one of the key things. People, no matter where they are or what they're going through, they can tell if you genuinely care and if you're there to help them or just to do a photo shoot. Because a lot of people just go to these devastated areas and take some pictures and then get the hell out.
Tourism.
Yeah. And when they see that you're willing to sit down with them and just listen. And
Yeah, Ryan, a lot of the work we do with small communities, often not in distress to the same extent, but being impacted by other people coming in or new developments or things wanting to take their land away and so on. What I heard from you was essentially just listen. And we've discovered the same thing. There's so many people coming in and trying to tell them what to do rather than ask them. And so if there was one conclusion, was to ask them what they really want or need. Ask them, don't tell them.
Well, and And so often, when we look at the things going on in these countries and the living conditions, we think that we're supposed to bring them up to what we're used to. That's not going to make them happy. And I learned that with this family and beliefs. My mother, when I told her about this family, she said, "Oh, well, you need to get them electricity and you need them to have a television so their children can learn from Sesame Street and things like that." And I said, well, besides Sesame Street, they would also see the extreme wealth on all these television shows. And then you would just expose them to how poor they really are, because they can't really understand how poor they are at the moment. You're going to show them that they are miserable. And we need to help them live the way they're used to living. Maybe improve that if it's not safe or it's not healthy. But there's no reason for them to try to live like Americans or Europeans. And they wouldn't be happier, I promise you. So.
And I want to say from my experience of working with you, Ryan, I was very surprised when we were at our meeting after the for the Afghan team from Warrior Angel Rescue and Vita School, and Ryan just created a space, and so the people who came in had like immediate safety to express themselves, and the things that came out were very powerful. Everybody gave in ways that you wouldn't normally see, and there was a level of intimacy and the willingness to share that was really, really touching. We had one person who had just been evacuated from Afghanistan who was running our school, and it was very, I'd never seen her be able to talk about that experience. So I want to thank you for doing that.
Well, war, of course, being another catastrophe.
So, but it's just experience. I've spent my career helping the desperate rather than focusing on getting wealthy. And so I've been dealing with people in their own languages. I've had to learn several languages over the years and just be willing to get dirty and listen. And in California with these wonderful women there, I felt good because, sometimes in a group of all women, when there's one guy there, you don't feel as comfortable opening up and talking about those things. But I was able to help them see that I'm not the threat and that I just want to help them find the healing that's inside them. And we don't have magic solutions for the terrible things in the world, but we can help people feel safer and we can help them feel loved. And that's what I try to get out there. And that's, I hope the women in California were able to feel that. It sounds like Marilyn felt some of that, but we're living in a world of so much selfishness, so much greed, so much bitterness. And so much of it just leads to this desperate underlying fear in so many people. And we have to get through that fear. We have to help them feel safe again. And it's
Ryan, I think you're the antidote to avarice, really, and we got to patent you, but then that would make money.
well,
But I much appreciate your comments.
David Pollock, did you want to make a comment?
Well, it was really just a question to Ryan about when your life is undoubtedly filled with so much sense of purpose and meaning, why do you think that not more people follow your kind of path?
well,
What really obstructs people in European, North American cultures from ultimately finding their way toward higher meaning? because you're in a minority in terms of the way people pursue their path.
Dr. Jackson, this is Deb. I'd be happy to say I think it's because we're too afraid.
Yeah. We have gotten used to a system where status and money matter more than anything. And I run into this a lot. I had to dissolve a nonprofit last year, and I've been since trying to find another nonprofit to run. And it's just so frustrating because people see my resume and they just don't believe it, because they think, well, this doesn't make sense that a person like this is focused on helping people rather than getting rich and getting a reputation. And why haven't we seen him on a TED Talk yet? And it's, people are so desperate to be acknowledged and to get fame and fortune. And I think it's always been that way. And there's a series of books called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I don't remember the exact quote, but there was a part of that where they were talking about how they were looking at it from an alien's perspective, that, Earthlings focus their lives on exchanging little green pieces of money, but it doesn't seem to help them much because it's not the green pieces of paper that are unhappy. But
I mean, just to push it a little further, the question then is, what are the factors that press us toward the desire for dollars and status? And then what are the countervailing factors that cause some people to say, no, there's more than that? Are there things in our educational system, in our laws for advertising? Are there family conversations? I mean, some of the factors that sort of you think can push people in one direction rather than the other.
I think a major factor is debt. In the
Debt?
United States, debt.
Debt,
D-E-B-T.
not death. Yeah.
Yeah, although death can lead to debt and vice versa. So many people in the United States get into debt to get their education, to get their home, to get their car, and then to get all the cool things that they're told they need, because we're living in a growth economy that the whole pyramid scheme is dependent on people buying more and more and more so that we can pay the people who previously bought more and more and more. And as we live with the debt, that creates this sense of fear and desperation. And it drives so much of what we do in our lives. So many doctors who went to medical school hoping to be like their heroes of old, who would go off to the jungles and work for free. By the time they graduate with over $300,000 in debt, they realize that's not an option. And as they continue to pay off that debt, and then they rack up more debt as they buy a home and have children and all of these things, they never get around to the altruism that drove them into medicine in the first place.
Were you able to avoid debt on your educational journey?
Oh no, I'm from a poor white trash family, so
that's what I thought
raised
you
by
said.
a single mom on welfare. I had a huge amount of debt, but over the years, I was able to settle down for a bit in Curacao and still do some of these trips on the side. But while I was in Curacao, I was able to get rid of most of my debt. So I'm in a spot where the desperation has eased slightly, but I have been through a couple of divorces, and so that I haven't been completely free of the consequences of debt and those things.
Ryan, Ryan, is it therefore a question of our inherent and intrinsic values, or have we fostered a system that drives us into very particular grooves, virtually programs us to value very specific things, such as money, or as they said in the Hitchhiker's Guide, the answer is 42. But, but are we in fact programmed by our system to choose values that don't relate to true success for humanity and its planet?
The system is flawed.
Yeah.
And I don't have a solution, because it's not,
If you did,
it's not
I'd
just
follow
the
you.
capitalism. The
Yeah.
socialist countries are affected, the communist countries.
Yeah.
I don't see an anarchist system working any better. So I think it comes down to the very basic thing. Do we care about other people? And if we care about other people, then we can do a little bit each day to help. I'm not telling people to just sell everything they own and live like a hermit, but we can do a little bit of good each day. If we see someone starving and filthy and hungry, if we just show some compassion and treat them like a human being, that does some good. I had a woman in Washington, D.C. who came up to me to sell one of the newspapers they publish for the homeless, to help them write down some of their own articles and make some money selling them. And I asked her if she had eaten. And she didn't realize that anybody actually cared. So I fed her rather than just buying the newspaper for $1. And she just cried, because I think it had been a while since anyone outside of her inner circle had treated her as a human being. So that was so little of my time, so little of what I had. But I think that's all we need.
Ryan, this is a wonderful exploration of values, and you're really forcing us to think of a much broader range of values. And I think each of the rest of us may have something to contribute. I'm trying to aim you guys at the end of this thing to talk about how we therefore contribute more to well-being, to the whole concept, and really what we want to do next, based on these wonderful experiences and concepts and approaches that each of our people have been bringing forward, showing that it is possible to have a totally different value set, and it may even be possible to communicate it.
Yeah.
I'd like to interject a little bit. If I might.
Yes, Van, go ahead.
Ryan, I was very inspirational. I think that empathy and compassion are things that if you bring to a situation and to people, are sort of immediately felt. They don't just require, they aren't communicated with words. They're communicated by people feeling our feelings, our care, and by what we actually do. And it's just, I found, again, it was a very inspirational presentation, and thank you for all you've done.
Thank you.
John, John Richardson, did you want to add something? John, we have to unmute you. Can you unmute you? Ryan, can you unmute him because he's talking?
Yeah, I can't unmute him.
No.
He has to.
John, you have to unmute yourself.
You may even be on the wrong mic if you have.
Oh, John,
Right.
I hear you now. Can you
There,
speak
we
up?
can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I think in terms of things that I've done in a small way, which Ryan has done in a big way, is to adopt people who I pass through in each day as clients. So there was a woman who was every day was sitting down on the steps of a building on the way when I walked to work. And I decided I would just share lunch with her. So I came and sit down and said, would you like to share my lunch? And every day for an extended period of time, we had lunch together. And then I was able to point her to some opportunities in terms of basic unskilled work at the university that was helpful. But I think the important thing, and I had other clients who I worked with, a lot of this, whether it's people at in every situation. I mean, I think it's true with students that if you listen and treat them as individuals with this non-institutional ways, you treat them as distinct individuals. But I think what Ryan has done, and I've heard, is a wonderful role model. And I also think just one more thing is the internet can be an enemy because people are too much wrapped up in their phones and not looking at the world around them and the people who inhabit it. And that's true wherever you are.
Yeah, sadly, it goes back to that quote by Dickens. We have everything and we have nothing.
Yeah.
He couldn't possibly have imagined a time in which we had all the information of the world from every civilization at our fingertips with instant translations. And what do we use it for? Cyberbullying, pornography, investing in imaginary currencies. It's
Sexting.
yes. So
Yeah.
it's
it has been a real, I remember I bought one of the first computers and I remember seeing the green letters creeping across the screen, and then conversations with, I can't remember his name at the moment, the person who wrote The Human Use of Human Beings, and also Professor Jay Forster. And there was much more hopefulness. The question is, how can looking around for different ethics, but we just have to use Ryan as a role model and get out there and interact with people and raise consciousness about them and spend time with them where they are, and depending on our professions, look for opportunities to make a difference.
Thank you, John, and thank you very, very much, Ryan, for letting us into your heart, into your life, into your solutions for going from catastrophe to well-being. And I'm sorry to make a pivot, but I have to make a pivot now or else we'll run out of time. But I've asked people, because I'm being pressed by the board of the International Club, to be able to say some of the principles we've learned. I've asked some people to think in a general terms what we found similar. And John Gilmore, are you with us? Could you unmute yourself and give us
very
your
much with
first
us, yeah.
impression of where the voyageurs have gotten on their journey up to this point?
Well, Ryan has just taken us on his personal journey, and each of us has brought to this group of voyagers an individual journey, and the journey that, and I think the beauty of our process is that we're trying to answer the question, what will bring about the change that we've talked about in the chat and in the conversations? What are those levers for change? And what is beautiful is that as we've joined each other in this journey, there are so many common levers for change. The listening that we heard today, the community base for interaction, for intervention that Ted has shared with us, the idea of substituting wealth with wellness, and actually digging deep into consciousness raising and improving the quality of our lives. So for me, the journey of the Leap Science and Math schools has been one of paradigm shift, my own paradigm shift, to challenge the assumptions that separate us from the possibilities that are real, from the limitations that we place on ourselves. So I'd like to say that the real issues that have arisen here for me are the issues of how do we change ourselves, and in the process, how do we shift the paradigms, and what are those levers for change? And I can say joyously that in this journey, I can find so many common levers, even though my context is so vastly different. Thank you, Anitra.
Thank you, John. I think that was very, very important to start with. Ted, you've thought about this for a while. How do you think the overarching realities are coming out of this huge welter of experience where everybody has had so much experience in such different disciplines, and yet there's something very similar, how they've gone from the status quo to a much more well-being situation?
Well, I'm going to start by agreeing with John because he said it right, that really we are trying to build on the individual experiences, the community experiences of people. I've had a thrash at pulling everything people have put on the table over the last few sessions into something, and we will circulate something later on, but we really need your advice on sort of where do we go next. And I think I led earlier that we have a number of opportunities that will allow us to share things on the 27th and the 50th anniversary, and also to put something together, possibly as a proposal, or taking it further, maybe broadening the group in the fall when the AGM is going to take place. We have both opportunities in hand, and therefore the challenge to us is to make a difference with it. We're all very different. I mean, some people are quite happy to talk about the flaws in the current metrics and analyses we're doing. And many of us can very easily tell us how fast we're going to hell in a handicap cart, and give us much more detailed timeframes and so forth. I think that's becoming decreasingly useful because there are so many people playing those games. If they're not listening to anyone, then they're not listening to us. I think it's seriously required to come up with some more positive alternatives. And I've got a couple of ideas myself. We've got to sort of show the broader frame of what we really mean by an acceptable future for humanity and the planet. We're keying at the moment on the term well-being. It seems to be becoming popular. There are a lot of different groups talking about it. And we each have different takes on the components of well-being. If I was doing an indicators exercise, extracting what people believe to be well-being, we have a huge list, and I'll share it with you guys at some point, once it's organized. But the point is that what do we learn? We learn that each individual is unique, that the summation of all of the experiences of people is reality, that if we try and throw a particular metric in front of people, very few people are going to salute. And in fact, it may be very situational. I work mainly at the community level, although I worked in the political, as a political animal at higher levels with the UN and so on otherwise. And I'll tell you right away, it's an awful lot easier to comprehend what well-being means to a community or a family, or as Ryan has shown, to an individual. And it's all very personal. And the idea of the summation of all experiences is not necessarily reality, but we can get into philosophy another day. But what we are really looking for is something that is replicable. Maybe it only works at the community level. Maybe it only works at the level of a small country or a small island or a small heritage area. But we do have to identify the components of success as perceived by the people who live it, and try and find ways to replicate it by making it more available to other people who may do it. The idea of somebody suddenly standing up in the bathtub and yelling "Eureka" and we've solved the whole thing is wrong. Not going to happen. Even if the answer is 42, they still can't get anybody to believe it. So we are really looking at what can we take forward collectively to show how we've been exploring this question from a biophysical, from an ecological, from a human perspective, and what do we have to propose to do next? We're not there yet, in a sense. It's not time to publish anything because we really don't know enough to do that. So what I'm asking right now for the next few minutes before we all have to go somewhere is give us some good ideas. We're going to work with them. And that's really what this particular part's about.
So I don't want to hog the space, but I do want to say that I've thought about it. And when I think about it and where the journey has taken me, I begin to see things in a very different way. It's like looking at Google Earth, and you have this half of the world, a hemisphere, and then you go down and you see your rooftop, and then you go back out again. But anyhow, I just want to say quickly the steps. And the first step is when I did the pivot from the degradation of nuclear power plants and all kinds of other horrible things into the coastal zone. And the judge said to me, "Can you restore?" I said, "I don't know. Nobody's ever restored plants under the water. So, but I'll try." And then I looked at the whole bay, not just at the nuclear power plant, but the entire 38 by 11 mile bay that had hundreds of degradations, and brought everybody together, stakeholders, government, decision makers, citizens. And somehow this process, which was called an American Assembly, where we all had the same questions: where do we go now? After being coached by the scientists that we should go in a direction. Somehow we all came at the same thing. We want to restore the bay and make it better. We don't want to live with this degraded bay. But somehow that caught in Florida, and then it caught up the East Coast, and then it caught on the West Coast, and finally around the Gulf of Mexico. And then I scaled up and went internationally down to the Caribbean and over to the Pacific, and held lots of workshops. By now, FAO and UNEP and CARICOM and other groups were very interesting. And we had a review of 2,000 trials of restoring estuaries in 17 nations. And a lot of people were doing this, and that was very heartening. And then people began, like Bob Costanza and Herman Daly, began calculating the benefits and putting money amount to the benefits and saying, okay, well, a coral reef is worth so much. And then other people were saying, okay, so much has been degraded, 50,000 kilometers. And then you could put the money amount the coral reef was worth versus the degradation. And you could say, okay, this is how much we lost. Why don't we put it back again? And so now we have a really good concept. Bob Costanza, for instance, has done a map of where the most degraded is, which of course are the Cameroon forest and the Amazon forest and the Central Asian forest. But the coral reefs where they're degraded, and we can actually frame money and need together. And somehow IPCC, which is the hottest game in town, has said, yes, we should have restoration. So that's 2 minutes for what's taken 55 years, perhaps more. But there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people involved in that, and they all want to go forward. They are less interested in the money than they are in the other thing. And so there's been just this huge pivot that I've seen myself, and that I'd like to integrate with everybody else's pivot. David, do you want to make some comments at this point?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that one of the things that's fairly critical in my mind is the question of, if we're to do something further, who are our target groups? And I think most of us have experienced that it's only feasible to grow where we're planted, to have an influence within our circles of influence. Sometimes they're much wider over time than we may have imagined, and sometimes they may be small but put down very deep roots. So because we have sort of an international target group and we don't know precisely who it is we want to reach, sometimes it may be local communities, and sometimes it may be other voyageurs of people who would have an interest. What I wonder about is whether the Club of Rome would be interested in putting together some kind of documentation that might be called something like signposts towards well-being. You know, and some of those could be around the theme that you just named of ecological restoration, but others could be more at the level of community well-being. And we've had examples of that in some of the presentations. And then some of us have recently been listening to presentations about countries like New Zealand that are trying to integrate some of the indicators for well-being into national policies. So it may be that a kind of a document or brochures or even videos, materials that could come under the auspices of the Club of Rome, or even a sort of a side grouping such as ourselves, where we make available some kind of publication or materials that share some of the different insights. Because the insights for a local community are going to be very different than if you're having a conversation with a national government. But I think collectively, as people work at these different levels, there's much of value that we've shared one with another. So that's one reflection on a further step that could be taken, I think.
Thank you,
Marilyn,
David.
do you want to?
There's been some talk of that before in parts of this group. And the idea of compiling something like a bank of success stories, a bank of high payoff things, getting the Club of Rome to act as the eyes and ears for something that would do improvement. And I know when I spoke to Carlos and also to Felipa of the possibility of getting something like that together, they were fairly positive. They just said, who's going to do it? And like, that's really what I'm saying right now. But the idea is we have a lot to share, and it's often success stories that can be shared and built up to something of more greater significance.
Marilyn, do you want to come in as an educator and say what insights you've been able to get from the group?
You are muted, Marilyn.
Okay.
Thank you.
This group's been very interesting for me, just starting in the field of education 35 years ago, where personalized education and the concept of an online education opportunity that was really unknown. And from that, how do you maintain the humanity and the human connection and not be attached only to outcomes and to accreditations and processes. And what I really liked was the concept of signposts, because what I would like to look at is all the beautiful ideas and how do we make them duplicatable in some way. And I thought what Ted said is so important, that it's going to be different for different communities, for different areas that we work in, or what John said about caring for and our own consciousness and our own self-awareness is so important. And then what Anitra said about the amazing work she's done on a global level and the heart connection of Ryan. And I think that I would love to see a document that it's not necessarily scalable what we've done, but what is duplicatable and what becomes a roadmap for others, so that the exploration we've done can be shared and somebody might look at it and say, oh, I see that school in South Africa. Maybe I could do that with a small group of children. Or if I really care for someone, maybe I can do that. Or look what Anitra did with bobby pins, planting seagrass. I could do that. And I'd like to see how that the good of the whole is amplified by the work that we've done together.
Van? You're mute, Van.
There, I just got it unmuted. I was just thinking through, I've looked through and at a whole bunch of approaches to, I don't know what the right term is, spiritual reality, religion, and have discovered that if you get to the mystic side of almost any organized religion, you'll find that the mystics agree far more with each other than the organizations do. And there's that commonality that just pervades everything. And it has some principles in common. One is humans are different from things, and every time we treat humans as things, something goes wrong badly. I don't know how much that can be extended. I was thinking of how if we keep looking for the commonalities, because the conservatives, liberals, progressives, diehards, it seems like there's no way you're going to get those different groups together. Right now, it just seems like it's getting worse, and the more and better our communication capabilities are technically, the worse it gets. So it's I want us to get somewhere. I wish I knew how to do it. I don't, but I think we do. I don't, but I think we do. So let's see how we can get to it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. John Richardson, I don't, yeah.
I think, John,
Would you like to join us with a few thoughts?
The
You,
one-
you put together the 10 models. So you should be able to think a few meta thoughts with us.
which 10 models are you thinking about?
Groping in the dark, I was thinking of the 10 models and modelers and all their experiences that you and
Yeah.
Dana codified into 1 or 2 tables.
Yeah, well, I mean, what we did in that, and I want to just say one other thing, but I mean, what we did was to build positive. So the global modelers were a fractious group,
Mm,
and we really did, we wouldn't call it that, but Dana and I were really doing ethnographic field research. We were as supportive, kind, affirming people, living some with each of these groups. and the period, and it lasted for an extended period of time. And partly through the process of this book, we transformed an adversarial culture into a collegial culture.
mm,
But I will tell you, and the fight is still going on, supporting that in an academic environment was not so easy because the institutions
Yeah.
are more competitive and adversarial. But we were able to do that. And I've been, now when I say the word China, everybody wrinkles their nose, and I know that. But I've built a group in China, and we've been meeting for 2 years
mm,
and are taking the idea of ecological poverty alleviation and seeing if it isn't possible that that's some common ground.
mhm.
So, I mean, there are things that we have in common ground, and these are four wonderful women, junior and mid professors, and that has had a number of spin-offs. So both with the global modelers and with my group in China, we've been building relationships that have their own value.
Mhm.
And then the work that we're doing arises out of the openness and mutual respect that we have for each other. And that's what Dana and I and Gerhard Bruckmann turned the global models into in various ways, from a set of adversaries to a set of partners to some degree,
Mhm.
even though still all striving in their own domains. But I don't know if that's transferable. But
Yes, I think it is transferable, but the good news is we haven't, any of us, approached this with an adversarial mindset, I don't think. Everybody has been willing to just open themselves and their whole experience to examination and listening by everybody else. And I don't see people pushing negatively against one another. I see people wanting to somehow merge and cooperate.
no, I'm
Yeah,
not saying at all critical. I'm just describing things in 2 environments have worked for me personally. And if people,
John, you are a success story because you've got different cultures and people to communicate with each other. One of the really hardest parts of this is to get people, even if they are in adjacent disciplines, to understand that they are actually agreeing on something. Because they are using different terms, they're using different metrics, they're using different data sets, and increasingly, of course, different communication sources. And that is becoming, I think, a larger barrier than it ever used to be. There were much fewer players, and they knew each other already. So by and large, you could get agreement more easily. I think this is also a very strongly emerging challenge that we're going to have to try and deal with.
John Gilmore, did you have a comment on John Richardson's?
Well, I wanted to comment on another two elements that have come through the input now. The one is the humanizing of all process, the reclaiming of the humanizing process. And I think Mampela was particularly strong in her presentation on the I am human because of you, the interconnectedness and the interdependence. I think this group has manifested that. And clearly, John's own life has manifested that. The second element of this group's discovery was we've moved beyond sustainability, language, and thinking to regenerative mindset and practice. And I think that those two shifts to the humanizing, by listening attentively, by inviting, by connecting, and then the reframing, what the mindset really is, quite significant.
Yeah, I want to just say one more thing about.
Yes, please do.
About the academic frame of review, what happens in our universities, at least in the National University of Singapore, where I've taught and administered for a number of years. And that is that our educational system, at least in Singapore, is an adversarial culture rather than a collegial culture. So every year you have what's called the examination board, and you ration out A's and B's. And I know when I was first there, I started helping some of his students and other colleagues' students in building their models. And we were gathering around, and I had them, I was living on campus in my apartment. He became furious. And he said, you've been talking with my students? And I said, yes. And you've been helping with their models? And I said, yes. And he said, don't ever do that again. Don't help students in my class. And I said, what? And he said, it isn't fair.
Yeah, John, I've run into that myself. I was one of the members of the Social Science Federation of Canada, and we were sent out to essentially mediate in faculties in various universities where people were at each other's throats over just that kind of issue. Not only that, but faculties were fighting each other over who got to study that. That belongs to me. You don't get to look at it as an agricultural economist because that's soil science. It was a challenge to get the people, even though they were trying to do the same thing, to talk to each other about it.
I'd just like to try to bring the conversation back for a moment. There seemed to be some
Then
developing-
Marilyn, after David, Marilyn then, okay. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I didn't know there was a speakers list. I was
no.
just trying to bring the conversation back to, there seemed to be some developing consensus that some kind of resource might be a step that we would like to take based on the various conversations and inputs we've made. And if that is so, then Anitra had asked the question, who is going to do this? And part of the answer to that question, I think, depends on what kind of resource. In other words, if there are little clips and editing that we want to do from various videos to create a video presentation of some of the highlights or the top 10 insights or whatever you want, then that's one process that requires people with some video editorial skill and ability and so on. But if it's doing pamphlets or if it's doing written articles, then there's a different process where many of us perhaps could commit to writing sort of 3 pages or 4 pages of a description of some of the key aspects that we wanted to highlight. So I'm just wondering, is it actual real consensus that we want to create a resource as a next step, or was there a conversation, Ted, that you referenced that Carlos indicated the Club of Rome may have some interest, but even if they do, presumably they would look to some of us to help to prepare some of that material.
Yes.
I think,
That's right.
I think that what we're aiming at is a report to the Club of Rome. And all of us, I think, I like your 4-page synopsis. And we have on different websites, the USACOR site, the KCOR site, we have the 40-minute webinar that each of us has presented, although there are a couple of us like Tom Powers, Van Hudson, who have not yet presented, John Richardson. And I think something easily could be done. And I challenge them, given the very poor quality of many of those reports to the Club of Rome, to deny. I mean, we just set up our referees, that's all. And then the referees say, yes, this is brilliant, like Circa and a few of the others who are, and then of course we have these integrative beginnings and endings, the way John Richardson and Donella Meadows had in their book, Groping in the Dark, which were very integrative tables and charts showing on how they all went together. But I think we may be a few months away from that. Ted, I stepped on your line.
Well, I'm just saying, yes, we have a lot of stuff we could pull together, but then the question is, who's the audience and what's the impact? The biggest impact that we've discovered at the Canadian Club is to put it on YouTube and put it online. And certainly we have had one or two of them go literally into the thousands of views.
Bill Reese.
Whereas the average document that we put out, even if it's an academic paper, is a few hundred or a few thousand. And it's read not by necessarily the people we want to influence. So I don't really have an answer. That's a question for you. How do you want to get to whom? Certainly, when I spoke with Philippa, she is prepared to help us, but she doesn't necessarily have an answer, nor does Carlos. They both are in agreement that we got some good stuff. Let's propose how it could be shared. But right now, it sits right there. So it's
Marilyn,
whatever we should decide to promote together or individually to take it further.
Marilyn's been wanting to talk.
Yeah.
Just a couple of thoughts. I like the idea of us putting our thoughts on paper and presenting them as a team to, either as a group or taking 5 minutes in each of us presenting. And I wonder whether we're looking to simply make a statement or really to do an actionable program out of this. Like, what is our goal and our end result? There's so many levels that we've discussed, and from spiritual consciousness to humanization to the way man thinks, to actions in the world. And I think it will help us as we decide what is it we want out of this. If we were to project where we go with this, do we want to create impact, and what would that look like?
So let's make a list. In fact,
anybody else?
Ideas.
Anybody else want to chime in here? Ryan,
Oh,
you haven't said much about this part of it, but I know you dominated the last part of it.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm all about action rather than talking. And so it's a shame if we continue to just keep talking about things without ever doing anything. So I think there's a lot of good ideas that have come out, and we need to consolidate those and distill those into some actionable items. And I think that would be a more productive publication than just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks.
John Gilmore, I know you've got to go in 2 minutes. Final words?
Yes, I do think we should work very hard to be our own audience as a starting point.
I like
say,
that.
are we happy with having captured what matters to us? And once we've got to that point, I think then we can look at ways of putting online pieces together, combining 2-minute videos, 4-page writings, abstracts, and do something really unusual with an online publication with links. I really think that, but let's start with ourselves as our own audience, because that's how we've built to this point.
Mm.
What an intelligent, handsome audience we make for one another.
Beautiful,
And I just put
beautiful.
a list of stuff I just heard over the last few minutes on the side. It's first writing down just a few thoughts. And I would encourage everybody to add as many as possible. I'm afraid I hit it twice, so it's it's there twice. But it was a number of just a list of the sort of things that we might want to consider worth taking further as a reserve, as considering, or as ways of putting stuff out, or key areas. They need to be fleshed out, of course, further, but if there's anything else worth putting on that sort of list, we can play with it over the next little while and get back to you.
That sounds great. I like that.
John Richardson, do you
Well-
have a comment on this?
I think describing what we need help in and others, it's not, I'm not looking for new things to do, but for support for things that I'm already doing. And maybe, so that's all what I would say. I think my own view is there are a lot of activities that we're engaged in, and our group can be a resource for that. I'm not sure we're looking for new things to do, but that may just be because I feel full up with things to do.
Thank you. Does anybody else, Van, anybody else have, Bobby, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah.
Bobby,
Oh, hi. I'm sorry I'm not set up for a video, but I have to say I found Ryan's presentation so moving. I was in tears for most of it.
Yeah.
It's just so right on and such
Sorry about that.
a beautiful consciousness of what it is to be human and where we need to go as a human race and how we need to evolve our human consciousness to a higher level and evolve our societies and our systems in ways that will help each and every individual to reach his and her full potential as human beings. And as Aristotle said, the individual and society are two sides of the same coin. And it's so important to get the system right, and healthy people make a healthy system, and a healthy system will make healthy people. And there's so much to do in so many areas, and all of you incredibly intelligent, creative people are coming up with wonderful ideas to move forward. And how we implement this is something that's so important as we look out into the world now and see what needs to be changing. For me, I've always had this feeling around me of love, that all of this miracle of existence comes from a huge, vast love that's beyond our comprehension. And it's always boggled my mind how human beings can mess up each other so badly in this incredible, we're living in a miracle. And if people could come to see that, I think it would help to change human consciousness. And I've worked a lot on systems. Being a lawyer, I worked when I was in law school with the state government, getting programs to help people. And so that's just a tiny, tiny part of it. It has to be a whole change of human consciousness. And whatever we can do to bring that about is something, it's a mystery. But I mean, you guys are right on target, and I'll be incredibly thrilled to see what you do. If I can help in any way, let me know.
Van, do you have final comment? Because we're going to wrap up within 5 minutes.
No. Bobby, you have a lot to offer yourself. I know that, but we could be glad to get your input. And that's enough.
That was succinct. I have to say it was very succinct. So anybody else who would like to throw in some comments, now's the moment to do so about the metaphysical, the big picture here that is emerging. And obviously it hasn't really emerged fully, but we see parts of it, you know, through a glass darkly, and we see parts of it and then they go into the fog. Voyageurs is a very good name because we're heading into the fog and parts become elucidated and other parts become foggy.
Nature,
just
we got
thought that
to find ourselves a new world then.
You think there's a new world there?
I just
Beyond
think
the
that
fog.
John Richardson's suggestion about being our own audience
Yeah.
until we got something we thought we were comfortable with, and then looking at a really creative resource where paper was linked to online, was linked to videos. I think that's a really good suggestion, that we become our own audience.
I do too. John always takes it back to how do we take responsibility for ourselves?
Mhm.
And I love that idea of creating a creative presentation that people will really access.
Mhm.
It has to be succinct and it has to be written in language that a 10-year-old could understand, because then it'll be easily translated and it'll be easily understood.
It has to be read by a cartoon character with lots of bells and whistles.
Well, the first audience, so, as Anitra said, is
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah.
What a brilliant and handsome audience we'll have. So anything else? And thank you, Ryan. We're terribly grateful for you leading us into this space that we hadn't been led into before, which is the deepest part of our hearts, and examining our own hearts and what we can do for others, do unto others as you would have done unto you. But I think that's a nugget.
Or the Putin
religions.
phrase, do unto others before they get a chance to do unto you.
That's the cynic in Ted the
I had
Canadian.
to give you guys counterpoint. I'm sorry. So is there anything else you want to share? The chat, I put some stuff in the chat, just notes I'm writing down right now. And if you want to send other stuff over the next couple of days, I'll be trying to wrap this up. Anitra and I are probably going to argue over it and see if we can get it into a reasonable summary of some of the findings. There's a lot more in there too, including the stuff that's very specific to Ryan's presentation, and the notion that emotion rather than logic, or emotion and logic, are both necessary, and how we relate them is going to be a challenge. But once again, it's the more complex interrelationships between human and biosphere, and between restoration and degradation and so on, that are really why we're all here, why we're challenged, and why we find this interesting. Okay, well, in that event, Anitra, do you want to say goodbye again to our marvelous speaker and tell people what we're going to do next?
The next is, and I hope that those of you who are able to come will come. I know that David and Van have both recently been through very serious medical procedures, but I know that Marilyn and Ryan and Ted and some of the others, Bobby, will be there in Boston. I hate to say it, but we in the Western Hemisphere, of course, had the first 4 important modeling books for the Club of Rome. But I think that will be emphasized without saying one word, by just saying this is in Boston, where much of it happened. And indeed, Jim Botkin, No Limits to Learning, was in Boston. And Masarovich started off when he left, as he said, Tito blinked and he grabbed his wife and kids. And while Tito was blinking, he made it to Boston. And his book, which John Richardson and Barry participated in, started there in Boston, as well as, of course, the Meadows and Randers Limits to Growth. So I don't think we need to say much except just talk about those 3 beginning books. And some of those who didn't want Dana Meadows as the first author in the German and other translations will begin to see, without us being chest thumping Western Hemisphere denizens. But anyhow, we're very grateful that Mom Fella took this time out of her busy life to come and pay us a visit, the way Aurelio Peche and some of the other leaders used to before the 90s. So that's it. The 27th of May from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock. If you cannot come, David, you can go on, and Van, you can go on to Zoom call. We will, if you tell Marilyn you need the Zoom call, she will send you the invite. And we will be very happy to have this event. Yes, John.
I need an invite too, because we're going to be having it's Memorial Day and we're going to be having a big
You'll be in Kentucky, Tennessee?
Yeah.
At a graduation?
A graduation for my granddaughter, who we adopted from India when she was just about a 3-month-old.
How lovely.
Super.
And she's now graduating from high school.
Oh,
How
great.
lovely.
I'll resend it to you, John, and to Helen Harvey and to David.
Yes, David Pollock can't travel. His physician is watchful about him.
He can run there, though.
It may be my wife as much as the physician.
Your wife is the watchful one. All right.
There you go.
So
folks.
thank you all. And thank you, Bobby, for coming.
Well, my pleasure. What a privilege, really. Thank you.
And we'll get some written stuff back from you, just summarizing some of these things. I think it's worthwhile to talk about where we think we might go next and get everybody to react, positive or negative, because we're all in this together, and together. We just can't do it alone. So we're counting on all of you. Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks.
Okay.
We'll see you in Boston via Zoom.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.
See you. And the Argentines and the Mexicans are also going to be there with us.
Mhm.
How nice, huh?
Good. Excellent.
Super.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank